Happy Sunday, everybody. If you missed last week, it is kind of a part one for today's episode. Don't really need to listen to the whole thing, but by way of brief summary, we were talking about will there be a physical calling out of the righteous saints at some point in the future? Are we to anticipate this future call out? And ultimately, I conclude that I think the scriptures are very clear that's going to happen, especially the kind of end of days apocalyptic gathering of the saints to Zion as Babylon everywhere crumbles around. But we ended towards the end with a quote from Elder Holland suggesting something a little bit different than the traditional notion of having a physical separation of any kind. By way of reminder, let's listen to what he said.
For more than 4,000 years of covenantal history, this has been the pattern. Flee and seek, run and settle, escape Babylon, build Zion's protective walls. Until now, until tonight, until this our day. One of the truly exciting things about this dispensation is that it is a time of mighty, accelerated change. And one thing that has changed is that the church of God will never again flee. It will never again leave Ur in order to leave Haran, in order to leave Canaan, in order to leave Jerusalem, in order to leave England, in order to leave Kirtland, in order to leave Nauvoo, in order to go who knows where. We no longer think of Zion as where we are going to live. We think of it as how we are going to live. Now, to frame this new task just a little, I wish to draw tonight upon three incidents Sister Holland and I have experienced.
Okay, so Zion isn't where we're going to live, it's how we're going to live, right? Elder Ballard agrees with him. So Elder Holland said that in 2012. Elder Ballard said this in 2015 at a leadership conference at the church.
Strengthen individual testimony. Strengthen the love of God, our Heavenly Father, and strengthen our affection and willingness to serve the Lord Jesus Christ. If we can accomplish that in the days that it appears that are ahead of us, that is the most important thing we can possibly do right now. Families are going to be very critical. If the things get difficult and more difficult over time, the refuge, the one safe place for people to be in and to return to will be to their homes.
Again, supporting Elder Holland's view that we're not necessarily needing to flee. Instead, we should strengthen our homes, strengthen our lives. It's the most important thing we can do. Our homes are our refuge rather than some distant location. Supporting this question that we're going to address in today's musing, which is, do we fight or do we flee Babylon? Then Elder Nelson agreed, clear back in 2006. Here's what he said on the topic.
The choice to come unto Christ is not a matter of physical location. It is a matter of individual commitment. People can be brought to the knowledge of the Lord without leaving their homelands. True, in the early days of the church, conversion often meant emigration as well. But now, the gathering takes place in each nation. The Lord has decreed the establishment of Zion in each realm where He has given His saints their birth and nationality. Scripture foretells that the people shall be gathered home to the lands of their inheritance and shall be established in all their lands of promise. Every nation is the gathering place for its own people. The place of gathering for Brazilian saints is in Brazil. The place of gathering for Nigerian saints is in Nigeria. The place of gathering for Korean saints is in Korea, and so forth. Zion is the pure in heart. Zion is wherever righteous saints are. Publications, communications, and congregations are now such that nearly all members have access to the doctrines, keys, and ordinances and blessings of the gospel, regardless of their location. Spiritual security will always depend upon how one lives, not where one lives. Saints in every land have equal claim upon the blessings of the Lord.
Again, echoing Elder Holland, right? It isn't the location that matters. It's what's in your heart. It's what's in your home. It's how you're living. Now, this quote from then Elder Nelson was more about gathering Zion, right? Not necessarily being called out before a destruction or being called out directly by the Lord to relocate somewhere. But let's assume, for purposes of today's musing, that there isn't going to be this physical call out, that we shouldn't be waiting to relocate to Zion or to some other physical location, that we're instead supposed to deal with Babylon spiritually, that Babylon is everywhere, that there is nowhere else to flee, right? That Zion is effectively no longer a noun, but an adjective, right? In other words, no longer a place, but it's more a way of being. It's a mindset. It's how we live. So what does that mean for us? How do we, or do we, fight Babylon or somehow spiritually flee? Here is Elder Holland. This is actually in the same talk from 2012. And so here's what he says.
We're going to have to fight.
Ooh, all right. So we're going to have to fight. How are we going to have to fight? Here's how he continued.
We're going to have to fight for laws and circumstances and environments that allow the free exercise of religion and our franchise in it. That is one way we can tolerate being in Babylon, but not of it.
Okay, I don't equate fighting Babylon necessarily with pursuing religious freedom laws. I've shared in past musings, probably 2+ years ago, it might be worth revisiting at some point, that I think it's myopic when church leadership focuses on religious freedoms laws to the exclusion of free association laws, free speech laws, right of association, private property, these laws and principles that undergird religious freedom. Religious freedom really rests on the foundation of freedom of association, being able to meet together and so forth, property rights, and free speech, basic First Amendment stuff. But this tunnel vision of, we're focused on the free exercise of religion, I think to everyone else around, it's like, this is all we care about. We don't care about your other freedoms, when I think they're all interconnected and intertwined. So I don't think, when someone says to me, fight Babylon, I don't think of fighting for laws and circumstances and environments that allow the free exercise of religion and our franchise in it. So, that one, isn't too persuasive to me. But here he is a decade later singing the same tune. This is in Germany when he was on a multinational tour for like 10 days throughout Europe, saying effectively the same thing. You are being called on to do what no other generation, no other dispensation has had to do. You are to cease fleeing, make an about-face, and confront Babylon and be victorious. All right, so stop fleeing. We can't flee anymore. That's not for our generation, says Elder Holland. Make an about-face and confront Babylon. Are we doing that as a church? Are we confronting Babylon? I mean, the admonition to be a good global citizen, supporting globalist organizations, hiring people like Aaron Sherinian, general conference talks that are all, I'll call them like Relief Society level talks of just nice things and superficiality, spirituality. Again, that sounds overly critical. Without, though, the substantive, like calling out of the wicked and calling people to repentance and being perhaps more bold, because when I think of confronting Babylon, as Elder Holland's saying, that to me depicts a level of direct response that we often don't see in a lot of modern talks, calling out political corruption, calling out mammon, wars, secret combinations, right? That's when I think of confronting Babylon. It's like, are we doing that? It reminds me of a scripture I've shared many times before, Doctrine and Covenants, section 123, where Joseph says that we should waste and wear out our lives in bringing to light all the hidden things of darkness wherein we know them, and they are truly manifest from heaven. So when we think about fighting Babylon, or in Elder Holland's words, confronting Babylon, that's what I start to think about, right? Wasting and wearing out our lives. If we're going to combat its influence, though, does that mean offensive war and proactive, or is it more defensive, even passive, almost like a Cold War? So what came to mind for me is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, probably I'm not saying that right, I can never pronounce his last name, who was forcibly exiled by the Soviets for his anti-communist views, his dissident views, after he had previously been sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag for criticizing Joseph Stalin in a private letter. So what set the Soviets over the edge and what led them to expel Solzhenitsyn to the West was the publication of his book, Gulag Archipelago, in 1973. And this exposed the secretive Gulag system in the USSR. So kind of the private, horrible prisons, the repressive tactics being used by the Soviets, the rotten communist ideology that produced this system. The night before he flees Russia, again, he's been kicked out for his views. I'm sure he was grateful rather than being, murdered. But his persona had grown so large that the Soviets knew that they couldn't kill this guy, that would be a big problem for them. So they banished him to the West. The night before, he publishes a final message to his country, to his countrymen. It was titled, "Live Not by Lies." Powerful call to action. I'm going to read just a snippet, but the whole thing is worth reading. He says, "It's not every day and not on every shoulder that violence brings down its heavy hand. It demands of us only a submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit. And this suffices as our fealty. And therein we find, neglected by us, the simplest, the most accessible key to our liberation, a personal non-participation in lies. Even if all is covered by lies, even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way. Let their rule hold not through me. And this is the way to break out of the imaginary encirclement of our inertness. The easiest way for us and the most devastating for the lies. For when people renounce lies, lies simply cease to exist. Like parasites, they can only survive when attached to a person. We are not called upon to step out onto the square and shout out the truth, to say out loud what we think. This is scary. We're not ready. But let us at least refuse to say what we do not think. Let each man choose. Will he remain a witting servant of the lies, or has the time come for him to stand straight as an honest man, worthy of the respect of his children and contemporaries? So, again, combating the influence of Babylon and all of its deceptions and the secret combinations and the corruption and the political correctness and the pronouns and bio and all the junk that comes with all of this, to simply renounce lies, to not submit to lies, a personal non-participation in lies. Then I'm like, okay, well, if it's standing for truth and refusing to go along with society and its ever-changing whims and cultural norms and pressures and social attitudes and, pronouns and everything else, that to me becomes a little more interesting, that fighting Babylon isn't necessarily this proactive, offensive type of war or anything physically confrontational. It's refusing to go along with the changing culture, which the saints throughout scriptural history struggled with. They're always imbibing on the cultural trends of surrounding populations, right? Turning idolatrous, turning their views and their attention from God. And so if we're saying just, not participate in that, don't go along with that, then I'm saying, okay, that could be combating Babylon, or at least its influence. And then I think of Ether 8. I think maybe, is it next week? I'm going to be doing a musing all about Ether 8, so we're going to dive more into this because it's tied up with Come Follow Me. But here's verse 24. Wherefore the Lord commandeth you, when ye shall see these things come among you, these secret combinations, you shall awake to a sense of your awful situation because of this secret combination which shall be among you. So this, again, doesn't say to have active combat or anything. Just be aware. And why be aware? Be aware of the secret combinations so that they won't have power over you, right? You can't resist an enemy whose influence you can't comprehend. So if we want to combat the influence of an enemy, if we want to resist its lies, resist its effects, right, we have to comprehend it. We have to be aware of it. We have to understand its nature. Here's verse 26, same chapter. Wherefore I, Moroni, am commanded to write these things, that evil may be done away, and that the time may come that Satan may have no power upon the hearts of the children of men. So this might be how we fight Babylon. If we're not, physically fleeing to another location to get away from the actual culture and commerce and all that that goes with it, if we have to be in the world but not of the world, then perhaps this is how we fight. Right? Moroni is saying, I'm writing these things so that Satan may have no power upon the hearts of the children of men. A personal non-participation in lies. You're guarding your heart and your mind. You're living not by lies. You're not living by the adversary's influence. You're not going along with those trends. Right? He wanted us to be aware of these secret combinations, Moroni did, so that the time may come that Satan would have no power upon the hearts of the children of men. So that I'm saying, okay, I can see fighting Babylon in that sense, right? I recall this quote that Joseph Smith allegedly said, saying that we're not strong enough to fight. These are allegedly, again, some of his last words that he shared with someone who was visiting the jail before the mob attack. So this individual later wrote this down and said, here's what Joseph said. I have a hard time with second and third and other hand, second-hand, third-hand quotes, especially after Joseph's death. Predominantly in kind of the polygamy context, but plenty of other things. I think people were a little liberal in claiming that Joseph said this or did that after his death when he was no longer around. But, this is at least very recent after his death. Nonetheless, we don't have, firsthand documentation. But here's what the quote says. You've probably heard this before. Our lives have already become jeopardized by revealing the wicked and bloodthirsty purposes of our enemies, and for the future, we must cease to do so. All we have said about them is truth, but it is not always wise to relate all the truth. Even Jesus, the Son of God, had to refrain from doing so, and had to restrain his feelings many times for the safety of himself and his followers, and had to conceal the righteous purposes of his heart in relation to many things pertaining to his Father's kingdom. When still a boy, he had all the intelligence necessary to enable him to rule and govern the kingdom of the Jews, and could reason with the wisest and most profound doctors of law and divinity, and make their theories and practice to appear like folly compared with the wisdom he possessed. But he was only a boy and lacked physical strength even to defend his own person, and was subject to cold, to hunger, and to death. So it is with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have the revelation of Jesus, and the knowledge within us is sufficient to organize a righteous government upon the earth, and to give universal peace to all mankind if they would receive it. But we lack the physical strength, as did our Savior when a child, to defend our principles, and we have of necessity to be afflicted, persecuted, and smitten, and to bear it patiently until Jacob is of age. Then he will take care of himself. Jacob, of course, being Israel, the people of God, and Jacob being of age, as he says, might imply that at some future point or presently that the church will be sufficiently large, no longer in its infancy or early stages, and will be able to take on a greater responsibility to combat Babylon, to fight back, right? To waste and wear out our lives in bringing the light, hidden things of darkness. So again, assuming Joseph Smith actually said that, that relates to the church only, a decade and a half after it was formed, still very young. The saints were condemned. They were rejected. God said, I'm going to reject you as a church. If you don't, build the temple and everything in time. I'm going to do a musing on that later. But the point is that he says it's not always wise to relate all the truth. So if we're talking about fighting Babylon, on the one hand, it says waste and wear out our lives. That creates provocative imagery, right? Waste and wear out your life in bringing to light hidden things of darkness. And then Joseph allegedly is saying, well, it's not always wise to relate all truth. We have to do it when we no longer lack strength. Now, as I read the book of Revelation, it appears that our task ultimately really isn't to fight, to combat Babylon in any sense that you might perceive. In the book of Revelation, the saints, nor the 144,000 that are called, they don't have any part in the opposition to Babylon, the dragon, the beast, the false prophets. They're not on the battlefields. They're only engaged in gathering Israel, those who will come to the church of the firstborn, right? The only task that the saints have in the book of Revelation when all this is going down is to, worship God. Don't take the mark of the beast. Endure in faith, withstand persecution, preach the gospel. The saints' opposition, if you can even call it that, really just comes in the form of spiritual resistance, which we've been talking about, right? Combating the influence of Babylon, guarding your heart and your mind. So, as I see that spiritual resistance, it's really fleeing. It's being aware of what the enemy is, where it's located, how it attacks, steering clear, exposing the darkness with the light. Of course, before, as we said last week, it was actual fleeing, right? It was physical fleeing. I think of even in the modern dispensation, Doctrine and Covenants, section 133. This is a revelation given to Joseph Smith in 1831. It says, "Go ye out from Babylon, be ye clear that bear the vessels of the Lord. Yea, verily I say unto you again, the time has come when the voice of the Lord is unto you. Go ye out of Babylon, gather ye out from among the nations, from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Go ye out from among the nations, even from Babylon, from the midst of wickedness, which is spiritual Babylon. But verily thus saith the Lord, let not your flight be in haste, but let all things be prepared before you. And he that goeth, let him not look back, lest sudden destruction shall come upon him." Now, the Lord said that at some point it would shift to stakes. This is 2 years later, 1833, recorded in what is now section 101. And it says, "And behold, there is none other place appointed than that which I have appointed. Neither shall there be any other place appointed than that which I have appointed for the work of the gathering of my saints, until the day cometh when there is found no more room for them. And then I have other places which I will appoint unto them, and they shall be called stakes for the curtains or the strength of Zion." So God's saying, okay, well, there's Zion and there's only Zion. It's the place that I've appointed. Now, when there's no more room, I have other stakes, and we're going to, right? So people today, they'll say, oh, we have the stakes of Zion and we no longer gather in one, specific place. But this revelation appears conditional on there being no more room. That wasn't really the case in Missouri. It wasn't really the case in Utah. But I'll set that aside. I'm not going to focus on that for this musing. Clearly, we know that the policy shifted at some point decades ago, and saints began to be discouraged from gathering together physically. Now you even have President Nelson in California a few years back telling people in California to stop leaving because there's been exodus. They've been consolidating wards and stakes, and the church has been shrinking in California because a lot of people don't want to raise their kids there. Here's a little quote from a visit that President Nelson made.
What kind of influence would the Lord want his people in California to have? The answer? We are here to make life better for ourselves and for others.
Basically saying, don't leave. You're here to be a positive influence. Remain in your community to be a positive influence. You're in a stake of Zion. And there's, we said in the last musing, the quote from, I think it was Spencer Kimball saying, the place of gathering for Mexican saints is in Mexico and Brazil. I think McConkie might have said it. And that seems to be the policy today. Now, as we think about, so fighting Babylon is one thing. As we think about fleeing, maybe not physically, but spiritually fleeing, coming out of Babylon, even if not physically, we're spiritually leaving that culture and that worldview and all of that, right? Revelation 18:4, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." Come out. Again and again, we have this type of message being given. Bear, be clean. You that bear the vessels of the Lord. Come out of Babylon. And this reminded me of Jacob 5. Of course, the allegory of, the Lord's vineyard. And the latter part of the chapter, I think, is particularly relevant here as we think of the latter days, the gathering, the call out, the fighting Babylon, the wheat and the tares, all of these kind of intermingling parables and concepts. Let's go to verse 62. "Wherefore, let us go to and labor with our might this last time, For behold, the end draweth nigh, and this is for the last time that I shall prune my vineyard. Graft in the branches, begin at the last, that they may be first, and that the first may be last, and dig about the trees, both old and young, the first and the last and the first, that all may be nourished once again for the last time. Wherefore, dig about them, and prune them, and dung them once more, for the last time, for the end draweth nigh. And if it so be that these last grafts shall grow, and bring forth the natural fruit, then ye shall prepare the way for them, that they may grow. Right? This makes sense. The whole chapter is about the Lord of the vineyard grafting branches in from different trees, trying to strengthen his vineyard. All the trees start bearing bitter fruit. He's struggling with the loss of his vineyard, this being a parable of the whole world and people moving around different locations. You got the Jaredites and the Nephites and the Mulekites and plenty of other ites around the world, the 10 tribes and whatever, right? And the Lord is leading these people away, and they're all turning corrupt. They're all going wicked. They're all becoming idolatrous. And then we get this, continuing in verse 65. And as they begin to grow, ye shall clear away the branches which bring forth bitter fruit, according to the strength of the good and the size thereof. And ye shall not clear away the bad thereof all at once, lest the roots thereof should be too strong for the graft, and the graft thereof shall perish, and I lose the trees of my vineyard. For it grieveth me that I should lose the trees of my vineyard. Wherefore ye shall clear away the bad, according as the good shall grow, that the root and the top may be equal in strength, until the good shall overcome the bad, and the bad be hewn down and cast into the fire, that they cumber not the ground of my vineyard, and thus will I sweep away the bad out of my vineyard. Fascinating, those two verses, right? A lot of us have this passive approach, I feel like, to a physical call out in the future, or the gathering of Israel, or, Zion and all of that. And it's kind of a wait and see approach. It's like, well, I'm just going to keep doing my thing normally, and, one day there will be some change and I'll be ready for it. I have my food storage and, whatever, right? I want to be one of the wise virgins waiting on the Lord. And yet here, my takeaway, at least my interpretation, is that it's not a spontaneous, sudden thing that all of a sudden, okay, time for this big, revelatory change. Instead, it's as the fruit grows, as Zion effectively grows and increases in strength and influence, then the bad branches and the bitter fruit are being cleared out in proportion with the growth of Zion. Don't clear away the bad thereof all at once, right? Clear away the bad according as the good shall grow. So Zion is not this spontaneous, sudden thing that just emerges and yay, the righteous qualify and we get to be part of Zion. And instead, it's Babylon is receding and weakening and losing to the extent that we are growing Zion. Remarking on that latter verse, Ezra Taft Benson, as president in 1986, said, it takes a Zion people to make a Zion society, and we must prepare for that. We must respond by saying that all is not well in Zion. What is this Zion? If we're supposed to fight Babylon, flee Babylon, combat Babylon, whatever, right? Great. The antithesis of Babylon is Zion, these terms that are used to represent various things. In Zion's case, it can mean the pure in heart. It can mean Independence, Missouri, a place of holiness more generally, the city of Enoch specifically, right? This term like Mammon or Babylon that just gets used to represent various other things. Well, perhaps one of the better definitions I've come across or explanations comes from Elder Christofferson, 2008. Here's what he said.
Zion is Zion because of the character, attributes, and faithfulness of her citizens. Remember, the Lord called his people Zion because they were of one heart and one mind, and dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. If we would establish Zion in our homes, branches, wards, and stakes, we must rise to this standard. Number one, it will be necessary to become unified in one heart and one mind. Two, to become individually and collectively a holy people. And three, to care for the poor and needy with such effectiveness that we eliminate poverty among us. We cannot wait until Zion comes for these things to happen. Zion will come only as they happen.
We cannot wait for Zion. We cannot wait until Zion comes for these things to happen. Zion will only come as they happen. Exactly. That's what Jacob 5 is saying, right? As Zion grows, then Babylon recedes. And Zion is not this, like, all of a sudden, the Lord's going to drop all this on us and say, it's time to flee to Zion, and poof, we have this amazing city in Independence, Missouri. That's not how it's going to happen. Babylon and Zion are more states of mind than physical locations. Ultimately, I do think it's about the land and the physical location and the literal gathering of saints to one specific location. We have to flee physically at some point. But in the meantime, there's plenty of spiritual fleeing that has to be done, building up Zion. I think of section 101. Again, this was 1833. We read a little bit there. I'm going to go a few verses earlier now. Zion shall not be moved out of her place, notwithstanding her children are scattered. They that remain and are pure in heart shall return, and come to their inheritances, they and their children, with songs of everlasting joy, to build up the waste places in Zion, and all these things that the prophets might be fulfilled. So Zion won't be moved out of her place. Her children might be scattered. The saints, went west, and now we're everywhere, and the saints in Mexico stay in Mexico, and Brazil, and California, apparently in California, right? So the children are scattered, but one day there will be a return, a come to their inheritance. 2 months after that revelation, Joseph received a promise, gave a promise that reiterated and clarified this. This is in section 103, revealing that the redemption of Zion would take place, but after much tribulation. Here's starting with verse 11. But verily I say unto you, I have decreed that your brethren, which have been scattered, shall return to the lands of their inheritances, and shall build up the waste places of Zion. For after much tribulation, as I have said unto you in a former commandment, cometh the blessing. Behold, this is the blessing which I have promised after your tribulations, and the tribulations of your brethren, your redemption, and the redemption of your brethren, even their restoration to the land of Zion, to be established, no more to be thrown down. So I do ultimately think, and I think the scriptures are clear, there's a physical gathering, a restoration of the saints to the land of Zion. Now, how are saints in Fiji and New Zealand and the Philippines and Zimbabwe going to easily get to Independence, Missouri? I don't know, right? Maybe in this huge apocalyptic geopolitical conflict, passports and whatever will kind of go out the door and we'll be able to sneak these people in across the border or whatever. Who knows, right? I have no idea what that looks like. But it's clear from the scriptures and the Lord's revelations that there will be a physical gathering precedent to the kind of apocalyptic end times that the scriptures have amply warned about. Until then, we are to combat Babylon, combat its influence, flee in a spiritual sense, despite not being able to physically gather in any unique location, and build Zion in a very proactive sense, being anxiously engaged in a good cause, bringing to pass much righteousness, not waiting for Zion, not waiting for the Lord to tell the church leaders to tell us something, but actively building Zion, and only then does Babylon recede. I think if we want to be like the wise virgins with our lamps filled and fully prepared for the bridegroom, we ought to be building Zion now and not in this passive, I'm just going through the motions, doing my checklist church stuff, and not actively trying to combat the influence of Babylon, wasting and wearing out our lives, bringing to light things of darkness. That to me is quite different. So all of this has been swirling through my head and has prompted me to start writing a book. I started work on this a few weeks ago. This will take me like a year plus, so don't expect this anytime soon. But I did a book called Children of the Collective, and that book was based on a single quote. And I took that quote and I expanded it into a book form. And the quote was all about how, between totalitarianism on the one hand and our literal and figurative nakedness on the other hand is like a child, the family stands in the middle, interposed between the state, the totalitarian state on the one hand, and the helpless child. And so the family has to protect the politically and economic independence and allow sufficient time for the child to grow. I'm butchering the quote. I didn't have it prepared to share right now. Point is, I took that quote and I grabbed these little nuggets out of it, and I turned each nugget into a chapter and expounded on this idea of why collectivists go after the children, why families need to be independent politically and economically, how they can intercede to help the child be nurtured away from the tentacles of the collectivists who want to capture the hearts, minds, and loyalty of the rising generation. I share all of that to say I'm taking the same approach with this book, tentatively titled Rise Up, and it's based off of the hymn it's in our hymnal, Rise Up, O Men of God, have done with lesser things, give heart and mind and soul and strength to serve the King of Kings, right? You've sung this. Now there's some interesting little stuff here, like the LDS hymnal omits the third verse from the original, which I find interesting, especially given the topic of that third verse. But I basically take, the hymn, right? Have done with lesser things. Well, what are lesser things? Like, let's talk about those. What are the lesser things that distract us or pull us down or pull us away? Give heart and mind and soul and strength to serve the King of Kings. What does that actually look like on a day-to-day basis, right? How do we build Zion? How do we give our heart and mind and soul and strength when we're in the world but not of the world, and Babylon's influence is all around us? So I'm taking that hymn and I'm breaking it apart, turning it into a book, and more focused on the men, because I think we live in a day when men have been under attack. I think the adversary does want to undermine the priesthood and righteous men. And granted, much of what I'm writing in this book is equally relevant to women, but it has a particular focus on the men to rise up, to be men of God, to be clean, to bear the vessels of the Lord. And so I've been thinking about this question of fighting Babylon, fleeing Babylon. What is the role of men in doing that? What's the role of the priesthood? What's all of our roles, men or women? What does that actually look like? And are we doing what we ought? Again, let's not be good global citizens. Let's actually confront, as Elder Holland says, confront Babylon and be victorious. He says to make an about face and confront Babylon. Now, I disagree that, fighting Babylon means fighting for religious freedom laws and leaving it there. There's so much darkness that we have to waste and wear out our lives in bringing to light. And I've said many times in past musings that I think these obligations ultimately are individual and not institutional. A lot of people wait for the church to do it. They wait to be told what to do by their leaders. They take counsel and direction and mimic what the church is doing, right? Oh, well, church leaders aren't talking about it, therefore it must not be important. Or if the Lord wanted us to do that, then President Nelson would tell us, right? And it becomes this very passive approach to discipleship. When I think these obligations, I think there are institutional obligations, and that the church is not doing what it ought in various respects, from my perspective. That's not a shocking statement for anyone who listens to my musings. But I think ultimately these are individual obligations, and that we need to be anxiously engaged, that we shouldn't be slothful servants waiting to be commanded in all things, right? Waiting to be told by church leaders what to do. And we've got the scriptures, we've got ample warnings, we've got counsel, we've got over and over again the commandment to waste and wear out our lives, to awaken to our awful situation, right? To awake, to arise, to shake off the chains, shake off the dust, live not by lies. Don't let the adversary, as Moroni said, right, that Satan may have no more power upon the hearts of the children of men. Ultimately, I think that's what it's about. And the Lord often says, right, that people will draw near to him with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. The very people who claim to be Christian, claim to be Mormon, claim to be amazing disciples, right, even they can be guilty of drawing near to God with their lips, with their words, with their superficial actions, but their hearts are far from him. Their hearts are set on the things of this world. So I'm going to be writing about that in my book over the next year. I'll certainly let you know when that comes out. But I feel it's an important topic to be focused on in our day when men are distracted and depressed and demeaned and derided and all of the rest. But certainly this counsel applies to all of us. I'd love to know in the comments your thoughts. How do we fight Babylon? How do we flee Babylon if we're not physically fleeing right now. What does this mean? What does it mean for you in your life? How do you as a individual or as a family grapple with this and, resist the influences of Babylon, guard our hearts and our minds? It's easier said than done. Living in the world but not of the world sounds great on paper, but it creates a really big mess in application. So I'd love to see in the comments your thoughts. Appreciate you guys listening. SundayMusings.org is where you can find any past musing that you might have missed, including links to multiple platforms to listen to it on the Apple Podcast. Would appreciate a review. If you like Sunday Musings, head over to Apple Podcasts if you would, and that's where I direct people to go leave a review if you're interested in that. But just appreciate you listening, sharing with others who might be interested in this, and we'll see you next week to talk about Ether 8 secret combinations and why oftentimes our church manuals and material don't really highlight one of the most important and imperative parts of the Book of Mormon. We'll see you next week.